Hey, Steve Saretsky here. As always, the Canadian real estate market update with a particular focus on Vancouver. If you get any sort of value or entertainment out of these videos, all I ask you to hit thumbs up and subscribe. Questions, comments, put those below. I want to start off the video basically with actually a giveaway. I haven't done one of these in a while, so as always, just a thank you for the support and following along this channel. I got a book here that was recommended to me by Professor Steve Keen, who we talk a lot about in these videos. I'm a subscriber to his Patreon page. I think he puts out a lot of good work. But it's called A Brief History of Doom, 200 Years of Financial Crises. So basically what the book is essentially covers all the sort of financial crises, panics, sort of large bubbles in various different asset classes, and documents them. A lot of it all comes down to sort of again, the buildup in household or in private debt, that leverage that basically creates this very unstable system that is prone to sort of any sort of shock. Yeah, so if you want one of these copies of this book, comment below, tell me why you want it. I'll basically just pick two people at random. But the reason why I brought up that book, and I'm going to basically tie this all in together, is it's interesting to see as the sort of air has started to come out of the Vancouver housing market here that all these stories are now coming out of fraud and government officials turning a blind eye, and that's really the thesis in all these financial euphorias is that in large, you can't have whether it's a bubble or not a bubble, but just in general, if you go back and look at financial crises and these large run-ups, there's always fraud. Fraud is essentially like a symptom of the bubble. So basically, prices rise. Nobody wants to question the prices rising because everybody's making money hand over fist. And then you basically get fraud, which kind of facilitates things further. And it's usually only after things start to unravel that people begin asking questions, looking for fingers to point and who to blame. And I can't help but think, a lot of that for Vancouver is everybody, kind of turned a blind eye to what's happening. Obviously questions about, money laundering and government officials. Now you're doing a public inquiry. Everything was sort of like, hey, that's being racist, don't question it. It's just, because we have, great land here and the mountains and the water, that's why the prices doubled in 3 years. But it's only now you're starting to get more and more of the stories that have come out. And as I said on Twitter, it's only after things slow down and people have a chance to sort of reconcile what has happened, that's when they then question and all these reports come out. So you had obviously the anti-money laundering. Now you're doing a public inquiry. There's been, mortgage fraud is being discussed. There's one mortgage broker. He wasn't even a mortgage broker. I wasn't even licensed, but he somehow managed to facilitate $500 million in mortgages. And I think 15% of them ended up on CMHC's books, which of course is backed by the taxpayers. So, of course, this mortgage fraud comes out largely after the case. And this is only one guy that they found. Obviously, there's going to be other offenders, and I've heard of it, anecdotally. I actually have seen some cases where there is mortgage fraud, right? People do falsify incomes. Not that any of my clients are doing that, but you definitely know what is going on. It is a pretty small community, but that's pretty much the thesis that I'll tie this all together. What I'm seeing in the housing market from that is those stories are starting to unravel. One of the things that has sort of temporarily helped the market, because I think what happens is these markets, when you get this buildup, they then become susceptible to any sort of economic shock. And so it's interesting because I think right now we're in a very precarious situation, sort of in the global economy. Things are starting to heat up again with the trade war. Canadian GDP increased, 0.4% in Q1. Very weak growth. We're seeing more and more tariffs. China slow down. Obviously, Chinese capital controls. U.S. dollar has been getting stronger. But really, the inversion of the yield curve. So basically, this is the bond market telling you, hey, something isn't right here. You have basically the entire curve in the U.S. funds rate, federal funds rate, entire curve below the Fed funds rate, except for the 30-year. So Raul Paul was saying this on Twitter, where I don't have a lot of respect for the guy. He thinks you're going to see a rate cut by September, and I certainly don't disagree. I mean, I think it's comical that the Bank of Canada is still talking up trying to hike rates. All you have to do is look at what the bond market is doing to the Canada 5-year fixed. I mean, it peaked at a cycle high at 2.48% in October 2018. It's dropped now about 100 basis points from that, and so we had 5-year fixed mortgage rates. My clients were getting approved at like 3.7, 3.8, about 6 months ago, and now all of a sudden rates are down to about 3%. You get a 5-year fixed at 3%. I had someone that just got approved at 2.9% on a 5-year fix. So the rates have really come down, which is interesting, because if you look at the Canadian economy as a whole, and this is getting back to sort of systemic crises and the buildup in household debt, despite rates being basically extremely low. I mean, in Canada they're at 1.5%. Mortgage rates are sub 3% basically, but you have debt servicing ratios are still basically near record highs in Canada, or at record highs, whereas the U.S. they're at record lows. Same thing for the Canadian savings rate. So basically, savings have fallen a lot in Canada as well. So basically, you have this large buildup in debt, this large rise in home prices. They're starting to come off a bit. But then you have savings. There's basically no savings rates. There's really not a buffer there. If anything should kind of go slightly wrong, which again I think is kind of a precarious situation to be in, and that's kind of been my thesis, and that's why I'm a student of financial history. Not to say that there's some sort of imminent doom coming here to Vancouver, but I look at it in the economy and how it's shaping up, and I continue to focus on that pre-sale market, because that's really a leading indicator of really jobs in the construction sector. And the strength, we're basically going to start to see more projects getting shelved. I had a friend that was recently laid off from a developer. And so we're starting to see that. Obviously, the single-family developers have been really slow, but that's kind of the main thesis of this week's video. Is I kind of have been focused on all the fraudulent stories coming out, how that sort of plays in the market psyche, and then I think that Canadian households have actually been given, again, another gift with lower rates here. That certainly eased the burden. It's funny because everybody, when rates were going up, I had people commenting on these videos and media reporters saying, "Oh my gosh, mortgage rates are going to continue to climb. They're going to hit 4, 5, 6%." And of course, I said I just don't see that. I think we're in a world where central banks have cornered themselves into this hole where you basically now have $11 trillion of negative yielding debt across the world, where central banks, in Europe and Bank of Japan and the Bank of Switzerland, they're pulling off all these crazy schemes where interest rates have sort of been artificially suppressed, and it's almost impossible to get off those levels when you have the amount of debt that we have today. And so that's why I look at Canada. It's like the Bank of Canada realistically can't continue to hike. Yes, they're going to try to protect the loonie, but as Raul Paul thinks, I think a cut from the Fed is coming, and that will probably give the ammunition for the Bank of Canada to then also cut interest rates as well. You're certainly hearing it in Australia. They're talking about cutting rates. They actually just removed their stress tests as well. They had a federal election, and they removed their stress tests. They're starting to ease credit. Again, I don't know if that's going to be enough to sort of stave off a significant downfall in home prices and credit there, given the backdrop. And it's the same thing here. I mean, we've had mortgage rates again come back down to sort of 3% levels, sub 3%. But for May, you'll probably see, you'll see a record low for single-family home sales in May, probably for the last 30 years. Condo sales have picked up a bit. We'll do a deep dive into those numbers next week. I think you'll probably see them at a 6 or 7 year low for the month of May. And so that's kind of been a decent May, definitely a decent May compared to, April and March and all those other months. But in historical context, still very, very sluggish across the market, and I suspect that will continue given where we sort of are positioned in the household indebtedness, in the savings rate, as well as the ammunition from the Bank of Canada to sort of ease on those debt servicing payments. There's really only so much room where they can cut, right? So that's pretty much the main thesis of this week's video. Hope that helped. Next week we'll do a deep dive into sort of the May statistics, what I'm seeing, etc. Anyways, see you next week.